Hey everyone, this is Libertarian Black Man. I want to shed some light on what is happening with the federal deficit today because we are currently experiencing something very unusual and it should be highly concerning for every American. The deficit itself is not unusual because over the past several generations, the American people have been asking for their government to do more for them. Pay for more housing, education, healthcare, food, jobs, and anything else that people feel is necessary for them to live the American dream. So this has required more revenues to flow into the government, and yet, though the people ask for more, they don't want the government to take more from them to pay for the things they're asking for. So what the government has been doing is borrowing money, trying to fulfill the wishes of the people without taxing the people. And this is where our deficits come from. What is unusual about the current situation is what has been happening over the past few years. From 2015 to 2018, the deficit rose 3 times in 3 years. Back in 2015, the deficit was only about $438 billion. Then in 2016, it swelled to $587 billion. In 2017, it swelled again to $666 billion. This year, we have hit $779 billion for our annual federal deficit. And if current trends continue, and we have no reason to believe that they won't, we're going to see a federal debt for the year topping $1 trillion. In 2019, according to budget experts, the government will spend $1 trillion that it does not have. What is unusual about this situation is that we are not in recession. And we have not been in recession for the past 9 years. The Great Recession ended in 2009, and the economy has been growing ever since then. When you have a recession, deficits go up. When you're coming out of a recession, deficits go down, except for the last 3 years and one other time in history. 50 years ago, back in the 1960s, we had a deficit situation that was occurring where the deficit was rising for 3 straight years and there was no recession. In fact, the 1960s was for the most part recession free, except for a small one in the early 60s, and the next one would not come until 1969. So for the most part, we were recession free in the 60s. And we did not have anything to cause our deficits to grow the way that they did, except for one thing. We were fighting a major war. The Vietnam War, which we began to get heavily involved in 1965, became more expensive over time, as wars always do. War is the most expensive project in the history of mankind. It requires higher taxes, higher spending, higher levels of borrowing. You don't know how long the war is going to last, and there's always a potential for escalation. So, wars require massive amounts of money that governments tend not to have, and so they borrow heavily, which is why we were able to see 3 years of higher deficits in the 60s without a recession. The reason that recessions cause higher deficits is because jobs are lost, businesses go under, people are laid off, businesses downsize. This is where tax revenue comes from. It comes from people. It comes from them paying in out of their income. It comes from sales of goods to people, and sales tax is collected. And whenever there's a decline of economic activity, there's a decline of revenue to the government. So recessions as well as wars are the two events that push deficits up. During the current period, however, we are not experiencing a major war. Major meaning one that requires a draft and one requiring the entire economy to be mobilized to help the war effort. We do have a series of smaller wars going on in North Africa and the Middle East and South Asia, but most people know nothing about them because they really are not major wars and they're not demanding that much in terms of resources from the American public. So we have not seen a major war or a recession take place over the past 3 years, and yet deficits have risen. There is a reason for this. Two federal programs are costing the government 40% of its outlays: Social Security and Medicare. And these programs are only going to become more expensive over time as the baby boomer generation, of which there are 76 million of them roughly, continues to retire at the rate of 11,000 a day. And that trend will continue roughly until about 2030. Social Security is a program that was created in the 1930s to allow people who were in what was considered old age at the time, at the age of 65, to collect an income without having to work for the rest of their life. Medicare was a program that was created about 30 years later to help the very same people who were collecting Social Security. And these programs are going to continue to get more expensive because people are living longer, they're staying on Social Security and Medicare longer, and we have one of the largest generations in history, the baby boomers, who have only begun to retire and who will continue retiring for another decade or so. So this is driving the deficit up because it requires more spending than we are as a government bringing in tax revenue. But there is also another component to all of this. Interest rates on bank and government securities are rising, and this poses a huge influence on how much our debt is going to cost. When interest rates go up, it becomes more expensive to borrow money. Instead of paying 1%, you pay 2%, or instead of paying 5%, you pay 8%. And this means that you can't borrow as much money because you simply will not be able to make the interest payments. The average rates for short-term government securities, those that mature within a year or less, were 0% in 2013, and they have risen to 2.3% this year. They are projected to continue going up for the foreseeable future. So the government is in a situation where it's suffering from the worst of two outcomes. It needs to borrow more money to maintain the senior benefit programs, and that money is also becoming more expensive at the same time. And that is leading us to another debt crisis. A debt crisis is simply a situation where there's too much debt and you can't pay it, and you're going to have to make a decision to reduce payments to creditors. Every economic or financial crisis is a debt crisis because you have people who are in over their head, unable to make good on their promises, and that can cause a loss of confidence in the financial system. This is what happened in 2008. A lot of corporations got into debt that they could not repay. And when one went down, when one corporation filed for bankruptcy, many others began to come down too because they were due money that they are not going to get as a result of that corporation who owed them the money declaring bankruptcy. When one company or a few companies go down, it can cause many others to go down, and this is where panic comes in. This is where a loss of confidence in the system comes in. It feeds on itself, and you have an economic crisis. All the result of unpayable debt. 2008 was a pretty bad year, and so was 2009. But we are in more debt than we were in back then. We have another crisis looming over us. And there are two ways for us to get out of the situation we're in. One of them is to default on the debt. Another way is to pay the debt by printing money. Now, the way that we should take is to default, not because it's a good idea, but because it is the best of two bad ideas. Defaulting just means saying we're not going to pay everything that we promised. So, for example, the government owes $21 trillion. What that means is we may have to tell our creditors, look, you're only going to get 15 trillion, maybe 10 trillion, maybe 5 trillion. But we certainly can't pay $21 trillion because our economy is simply not capable of producing that. If we do not default, the only way out would be to inflate the money supply and use the money to pay debts. But what this does is it destroys the value of the money, because while we are producing money and putting it into circulation, we are not actually producing more goods. When too much money chases too few goods, prices go up. People find themselves going bankrupt, unable to pay their rent, unable to pay their mortgage, their car note, their grocery bill, water bill, electric bill, or property taxes, and they're in a pretty bad situation. Their standard of living is falling, and if it gets to an unacceptably low level, then you're going to start seeing more political turmoil, more uprisings and insurrections. Worst case scenario, you see a violent revolution where people just say, it's not even worth trying to survive anymore to live the way we have to live. I hope we don't get to that point, but we know we've had revolutions before, one of them in the 18th century and the other one in the 19th century, where people actually rose up and fought a war against the government. So, are we going to see that in our lifetime? Maybe not. But to say that it will not happen while we are on the path to destroying our money is to say that we don't believe in the possibilities. And we really do live in a time where anything can happen. So, if we're going to be in the situation of getting up to our eyeballs in debt where we are today, over our heads, we better take the wise option, which is to default. And that would mean a recession, a depression even. It would mean higher unemployment. Many people are going to lose what they have. But the worst option is to destroy the money, because you're simply hurting more people. And you don't avoid a recession when you have inflation. You just create a situation where you postpone it. But it's always right there ready to come in when the inflation stops, if in fact we get to that situation. So, for those who are watching, understand that we're going into deeper deficits because we have a lifestyle that we want that we don't want to pay for. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you in the next video.